When I was a lot younger, my dad used to tell us scary stories to spook us before going to bed, some of which he would make up himself, but a few times he'd pick out a spooky book to keep us awake at night thinking about the boogeyman or the big toe story from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. But one of my favorites was always The Mystery of Chimney Rock, which was a choose-your-own-adventure novel with quote-unquote 36 exciting endings. You were the main character of the story, and it were up to you to get a good ending or not. Making decisions became a lot more stressful because you didn't want to mess up and get a bad ending. Being in control of the character's actions was a whole new way to experience stories. Even though the ending of the book for me was a little lame because I got the bad ending, I was still in love with this immersive style of storytelling. But as the years went on, I never saw it get the attention and care it deserved. There were interactive stories on Netflix, but with a few exceptions, those were very simple and not the greatest. And there's still a good amount of interactive books, but for those who really wanted to experience the art of interactive stories, they would normally turn to video games. As did I with Telltale's The Walking Dead. This interactive story finally put choose-your-own-adventure video games on the map, along with its developers, Telltale Games. The game had a massive focus on making choices to determine how the events of the game will play out, and that is easily told to the player with the simple, effective, and iconic text. This game series adapts to the choices you make. The story is tailored by how you play. The game was a pioneer of interactive adventure games, which became a subgenre of adventure games with later hits such as Life is Strange, Detroit Become Human, and The Wolf Among Us. With all these big interactive adventure games coming out, Supermassive decided to throw its own hat in the ring in 2015 with its interactive horror game, Until Dawn, which was a hit upon release. With a massive success under its belt, Supermassive began to make more games in that genre, with the Dark Pictures anthology series, which weren't as critically or financially successful as Until Dawn, until 2022 where they released The Quarry, which was another critical and financial hit. Both these games share a lot of the same concepts, being interactive horror mysteries that pay a lot of homage to classic slasher and monster movies, which makes it unique to Telltale or Quantic Dreams games. These games both tackle the choice angle in a way that fits the tone very well. It feels like every decision, whether large or small, will ultimately affect the character's outcome. Even when they don't, the game has you doubting that maybe you fucked up earlier out in the game and mistakenly got one of your favorite characters killed. These make for very stressful and tense games, along with its slasher premise, makes these games truly some great examples on how to execute fear in a video game. These two games are very similar, and I've been racking my brain trying to figure out which one I prefer. So I decided that today I will compare the two games and determine which is, overall, the better game. I will go through every aspect of these games I think are important to discuss and will come to a conclusion. I won't be tallying up points because I think that's redundant in a comparison like this. These games are neck and neck in quality, so I'm not going to let the fact that Mike is hotter than Jacob determine if Until Dawn is better than The Quarry, or vice versa. I'm going to compare, contrast, and determine which is the better game, Until Dawn or The Quarry. Until Dawn is a classic horror mystery slasher at heart, and one of the best aspects of the game is its mystery. The game follows a group of friends enjoying each other's company up on a lodge on the anniversary of their friend's death, Beth and Hannah, who ran off into the woods after a humiliating prank pulled by our protagonists, excluding Sam, Josh, and Chris. They were chased by something in the woods and offered a hand by a mysterious man, but despite his efforts, they both fell and died. Or at least that's what we first think. The real mystery of this game is shown to you through collectibles, which works very well for this kind of game, where you're careful about everything you do in fear of missing something and getting someone killed. So pretty much what's going on is that there's this indigenous curse that turns people who resort to cannibalism for food to Wendigos, and about 50 years ago, miners got trapped in the mines and turned into these Wendigos that reside up on the hill. Jack Fiddler, better known as the Stranger, is determined to kill all these Wendigos after one killed his grandfather. He attempts to save Beth and Hannah in the opening, but fails to do so, but doesn't notice that Hannah actually survived the fall, and with no other option to survive, starts eating Beth, which then turns her into a Wendigo. A year later, after the accident, Josh invites all of his friends back to the lodge with the plan to prank them by dressing up as a serial killer and scare them mercilessly, albeit without trying to permanently harm them. When the group realizes Josh is the mystery man, they lock him in a shed where he gets taken by a Wendigo, and later gets his head either crushed by Hannah or left in Hannah's lair, where he then eats the stranger's head and turns into a Wendigo. But even though there is an underlying mystery to the story, it's a lot more focused on our main characters trying to survive the night with these monsters, which all culminates in the climax. Sam, Mike, and the others you kept alive to this point all face off against Hannah and 2 other Wendigos in an incredibly thrilling, scary, and stressful climax that is done wonderfully. When the credits roll, we get interrogations of the characters that survived during the game, which is a nice way to end it off. Overall, a decent story with a fantastic mystery that left me thinking about the game long after I had finished, which was a part in thanks to the Wendigo. Hannah is such an amazing villain with a phenomenal design. These are some of the most brutal, intense, and scary monsters I've ever seen in a video game. If I were in a room with these things, I'd be dead in milliseconds, and I can feel that playing this game, which makes the mystery and villain fantastic. The Quarry, on the other hand, also has a really good story. It's about 9 camp counselors trying to survive one final night at Hackett's Quarry, with mysterious ghosts, monsters, and hunters around every corner. The monsters being a spin on werewolves, all starting with Silas the Wolf Boy, who is a freak show attraction at Harem Scarum, a show ran by Eliza, the woman who found him and keeps him locked in a cage to profit off of him. Caleb Hackett sympathizes with Silas and tries to rescue him, but inadvertently causes the show to burn down, killing Eliza and getting himself bitten and transformed into a werewolf, which he then infects his sister Kaylee and father Chris. The Hacketts dedicate their lives to finding Silas, which is where we find them in this game. They try their best to keep the teenagers safe from Silas and the other werewolves throughout the night, but aren't the most friendly and often play the role of secondary antagonist. Throughout the game, different characters can get infected, which will turn them into werewolves, but to end the curse, they have to kill the werewolf that infected them, which all culminates in the finale where you kill Silas, the curse is broken, and everything goes back to normal. Or you could keep him alive and the curse lives on. Again, another great mystery, but I don't think it's as good as Until Dawn's. It is creepy to think about your friends turning into werewolves and killing you, and that did leave a lingering thought after the game. The werewolves are fantastic in this game, and even though they aren't as good as the Wendigos, they're still very threatening and unique. There's just one major thing about the story that really annoys me, and that's the ending, but I'll talk about that later. But the reality is, you can't have a good story without good characters, which these games excels at. The characters in Until Dawn are classic horror stereotypes, which again works wonders for this game. Sam is the final girl, and everyone loves her. How can you not? Hayden Panettiere is a living god. All jokes aside, she's genuinely a really likable character, and it makes me wonder why she's hanging out with some of these assholes. She's clearly the most connected with Josh, which makes it sad to think that he emotionally scars them for the rest of their lives. Unlike most of the other characters, Sam only has one death scene, which I think is fine, but goddammit is it a difficult don't move section. But it does make for an intense climax, so it works well. Then there's Mike, the jock, who's in a relationship with Jessica, the pretty girl. At first, Mike kinda seems like a dick, but when shit really hits the fan, we see that he's actually pretty heroic and brave, if not a little headstrong. He's pretty damn likable, and also only gets one real chance of dying at the end, and that's if you fuck up as Sam. If so, he could either be burned alive or burn himself alive, which is a lot more badass. There's also his relationship with Jessica, which I do think is sweet, but a bit annoying at times. He spends a lot of time with her at first, but then after she's kidnapped, we don't really see her for the rest of the game. So overall, we don't see a lot of Jessica after she's kidnapped, which is a bit of a shame, because she's a likable character. Sure, most of her screen time is dedicated to trying to have sex with her, which is alright, I guess, but she does show some character from time to time. But she definitely gets the worst out of everyone. I mean, look at her face in the end. The motherfucker's traumatized. She also doesn't get along well with Emily, the bitch, which, to be fair, does anyone. Honestly, I'd argue neither of these games have outright dislikable characters, excluding her. She's a massive asshole who's a dick to everyone around her, and I did not care if she died or not. She sometimes acts a little nice, but not enough to make up for all the shit she puts everyone else through. Especially Matt, the nice guy, who is forced to put up with her. He literally has a better chance of survival if he straight up ditches her. Speaking of Matt, he's honestly one of my favorites. He just seems like such a chill guy, and I really liked him in most scenes he's in. And the flare gun choice is one of my favorite in the game. Moving on to Chris, the nerd, and Ashley, the nice girl. Both are fine for the most part. They are cute when they're together, but separately, they don't add a lot to the game other than some cool moments. And they both can get decapitated, and decapitation is one of the coolest forms of death ever. And finally, Josh, the killer, I guess you can call him. Josh is a very interesting and tragic character that I am endlessly fascinated with. His therapy sessions break up the story very well, and I love the well-executed twist. And his post-credit scene is a perfect ending to the story. And then of course there's other characters like the stranger, the therapist, and Beth, which I all think are solid, but of course Hannah is one of the greatest horror villains I've ever seen. All in all, Until Dawn has a pretty solid cast with very memorable characters, but some of them are a little too stereotypy. Not in a bad way, but more in a bland way. They could have been more developed. But not only does the Quarry make their characters more developed, they make them realistic. I don't care if video game characters are realistic, but with this type of game, putting that extra mile was well worth it. Starting with Laura, the game's protagonist? I mean, she definitely feels like the protagonist after finishing the game, but she's not even in half of it. And that sounds like a bad thing, but it isn't really. She disappears in the prologue and for the first half of the game is nowhere to be found, but when we finally meet up with her, she goes through a pretty lengthy flashback that I did enjoy, although it was a bit of a weird choice pacing-wise. But when she finally shows up, she's in full badass mode, and I love it. She pairs very well with Ryan, surprisingly, and I loved their little back and forths. Ryan himself turned into my favorite the more the game went along. He's chill and drives the plot forward and has a good chemistry with nearly everyone he interacts with. And I loved his relationships with Caitlin and Dylan. Normally, I fucking hate love triangles. They're so cliche and annoying, and they turn likable characters against each other, and it's a whole mess. But I think they do this one fantastically. Caitlin and Dylan are both likable characters that like Ryan for obvious reasons, but they aren't antagonistic towards each other. They actually connect and become friends because of their common interest. They spend most of the second half of the game together and make a nice connection. They're also just really likable characters, especially Dylan. He's fun and charismatic and shows how selfless he could be in his transformation. And he serves for some good representation. Caitlin, on the other hand, I wasn't a huge fan of at first, mostly because how she treated Jacob. But then I soon realized how close the two were, which did make it better, but honestly I feel like it could have been developed more. Instead of Caitlin absolutely trashing Jacob, she could have been there for him and tried to get him to open up about his insecurities until he shuts her down because of the whole toxic masculinity thing. Which brings me to Jacob, who definitely wasn't my favorite, but not because he was poorly written. He's goofy and impulsive, but very insecure, which leads to a simple yet effective scene where Jacob is crying on the docks after Emma kisses Nick. Speaking of Emma, who is, or at least was, in a relationship with Jacob, she's definitely the Emily of this cast, but honestly a worthy addition, because she's not trying to make Jacob's life a living hell or anything. She's just inconsiderate about his feelings sometimes. Obviously she's justified in wanting to end things off, but the way she treats him afterwards isn't okay. But admittedly spices up the plot. She can definitely be a badass though, which is welcome. And then there's the other characters, Nick and Abigail. Abigail was someone I really enjoyed at first. She's innocent and cute, and you desperately don't want anything bad to happen to her. She has a crush on Nick, who... well, he's... I don't know, there's not a lot to Nick. He transforms into a werewolf so early that you never really get the chance to connect with him before he goes all werewolf mode. He does serve for some good exposition. And then there's the Hacketts, which I think serve for good red herrings. The hag of Hackett's Quarry is spooky, but obviously the spotlight goes to Silas the dog boy, the main antagonist. Creepy fucking design, and I think the eyes do wonders for its overall scare factor. Obviously Hannah is the much more threatening antagonist, but overall, I'd have to say the Quarry has the stronger cast of characters than Until Dawn's. They feel a lot more realistic and grounded, whereas Until Dawn's characters were a lot more stereotypy. All in all, some very unique, memorable characters that drive the plot forward. Only a few bad apples, but characters like Sam, Ryan, Matt, Dylan, etc. are really special, which is good because most of the stress comes from keeping your favorite characters alive. But if it were just a plot and characters, these would be really long and boring movies. So what makes these video games good as video games? Now, obviously, the fact that these are interactive stories doesn't just matter when it comes to the choices you make. You're in control nearly the entire game, which is fantastic for immersion. Nearly every time someone interacts with your character, there's an option on how to respond. How these are set up is that there's usually two choices for dialogue on the left and right sides of the screen. They both have choices on how to respond, with more detailed responses below them. I think these really work. I rarely misunderstood a response, although sometimes I could feel cornered into one of two responses that I don't want to make. And again, even that's rare. The QTEs are pretty good, but a lot easier in the Quarry than they are in Until Dawn, with a few major changes. In Until Dawn, there's 4 types of QTEs. The button presses, the don't move segments, the aim and shooting, and the choices. whereas the Quarry has the stick movements, don't breathe, and again, the aim, shooting, and choices. I think the button presses are more fun and difficult, therefore more rewarding in Until Dawn, so I don't know why they changed it, but it's such a minuscule change that it doesn't bother me too much. And sure, it is a bummer that they didn't keep the don't move segments, but it's understandable because they went multi-platform for this one and that was just something they couldn't do. So this is a fine replacement, although a bit hard to understand at first, which is annoying. The aiming and shooting is a lot more fun in Until Dawn, probably because you get to do it more than in the Quarry, and the targets and sound effects are perfect. You really feel like a badass using a gun in Until Dawn. And finally, the choices, which are pretty much the same in each. I did notice that it's a lot more difficult to tell which option will get someone killed in the Quarry, which honestly is a little unfair. Although I'd say the controls are improved quite a bit in the Quarry, and I prefer the over-the-shoulder angle. While you walk around, you can find little collectibles in Until Dawn. You can find Mystery Man clues, 1952 clues, Twins clues, and totems. The clues are all mostly the same and show different parts of the lore of this game, but it's the totems that are really special. They show you the future and possible things that could happen, and they really add to the atmosphere and stress of the game. But I will say, I think the Quarry does the hints a little better. As annoying as it could be to find them, I think the tarot cards are a lot more useful, which is probably why they limit how much predictions you can see. And of course, the Quarry has a type of clues with Freak Show, Camp History, and Hack It History clues, but they also added evidence, which I think is a very nice addition. The amount of evidence you collect affect your ending, and I think on replays, it's a nice incentive to find them. I'd say that both games' collectibles are both equally strong, but Until Dawn has the better gameplay overall. Then, there's the reason a good amount of people even play these games: the horror. Starting with the setting. In Until Dawn, we have Blackwood Mountain, which is an amazing setting. The harsh, cold, and open woods really add to the suspense. There's always the thought of what could be lurking in those woods. They almost seem like they could go on forever. It feels almost claustrophobic in the cabin and in the mines, where the thought of running off feels impossible. You just keep running until something eventually gets you. Most of that also applies to Hackett's Quarry, just to a lesser degree. It is a spooky dark forest, but not as endless as the mountains, so the broken down car is appreciated. Then there's the jump scares, which I personally love. I know that they're controversial and all, but I love them. Until Dawn is loaded with scares, but the Quarry refrains from an obsessive amount of jumps. Instead, they have this slowly growing uneasiness present in the game, which I think works very well, because most people who have played the Quarry have already played Until Dawn, so they know what to expect, so making them wait for it was the perfect decision. But one thing the Quarry did not drop was its gore. Until Dawn may have had a handful of slow, gross close-ups, but the Quarry is violent and fast, and the graphics really help. The decision to use motion capture for these games, I believe, was a perfect one. The realism helps immerse us and horrify us when we see these characters get ripped apart. It really makes it feel like this sort of thing could happen to you, which of course is a terrifying thought. And then there's the antagonist, which I did already touch on earlier, but need to reiterate. The Wendigos are fucking horrifying. They alone tip Until Dawn a bit over the Quarry with its horror. But there has been something that I haven't touched on yet, which I think is important to discuss about these and many other interactive adventure games. Now, what do I mean by the illusion of choice? Well, in all these adventure games, as much as they could say the story is entirely up to you, it's not. You will eventually reach the ending, and there are things that just happen that aren't up to you. But the magic of these games come from thinking that they are. There are dozens of dialogue choices in both of these games that don't matter in the slightest. But it becomes really special when these games make you think that they do. It's a great way of making you attached to these characters because it feels like there's a part of you in all of them, and that your choices are affecting each and every one of them. Both of these games are really good at making your choices feel like they matter, but it's at the cost of payoff. You could put all of your love and care into Emma and Jacob's relationship, but if you fuck up a QuickTime event and get Jacob killed, you miss the payoff for their relationship and all that buildup went nowhere. But sometimes the game is worried that you did get a character killed, so they structure the game in a way that won't be affected that much by a choice. This may be confusing, but here's an example. In the beginning of Until Dawn, Mike and Jessica's relationship is heavily centered on. Every choice feels like it's building to something, but then Jessica gets attacked, and if she dies, all that buildup is thrown away. It doesn't matter if she likes you or not, she's dead. But if you do manage to keep her alive, it still doesn't matter because these two characters never interact again. See what I mean? The build-up only factors into how much clothes she ends up wearing. Neat. Now it's interesting because while Until Dawn is disappointing from a character perspective, The Quarry's disappointing with its plot. Until Dawn, as I mentioned earlier, has an awesome as hell ending where everything comes together by the end and you kill Hannah through a gauntlet of don't move sections and tough choices. The Quarry doesn't have that. I mean, there is this car chase at the end, but it's way too easy, and the final decision is just weird, and at the end I kind of felt disappointed with its ending. This is added upon with no real after-credit interviews like Until Dawn, which I found extremely bizarre. Until Dawn may have had some disappointing moments with its build-up and payoff, but this at least fixed some of those problems, although it could have been better. But in The Quarry, it just ends with no final hurrah for either the plot or the characters. Just a shitty podcast episode. A good example for an ending would be Telltale's The Walking Dead. No matter what you do, the plot will always lead you to this moment, with Lee and Clementine in the police station, which should make it feel like your choices didn't matter, but they do. Because no matter what you do, these characters will go through their character arcs and finish this amazing story on its own terms. Which sadly, Until Dawn and The Quarry do not do, because it's too scared of you killing a character that sometimes it doesn't even have a payoff, and when it does, most of the time it's pitiful. You see, The Walking Dead has one incredibly well-developed ending where everything pays off, whereas Until Dawn and The Quarry has dozens of half-baked endings where not everything pays off, and I personally prefer the former. But the reality is, even though it may not be as satisfying and effective as The Walking Dead, it's a hell of a lot more fun. These games are both scary and fun, which is something they both do spectacularly, but trying to figure out which one does it better was incredibly hard. But ultimately, Mike is hotter than Jacob, so I'll have to give it to Until Dawn. All jokes aside, I do think that Until Dawn is more scary and more fun, which are the two biggest things going for these games. But honestly, that doesn't matter. These games weren't meant to be compared, they were meant to be enjoyed as individual works of art. So what the hell am I doing here?